Recently, I played through something that I really enjoyed. It covered everything from mass cloning to alien invasions and generational trauma. It was a truly remarkable experience, but I've been having a tough time trying to define what this experience is. A lot of people would call it a game, but there is so little gameplay within it that I find it impossible to agree, because in 1000 X Resist, the largest hurdles, if you can call them that, are simply walking around, clicking golden circles, and moving through timelines. This is the extent of the actions available to you, and there's no real challenge involved. And I should reiterate here that I think 1000 X Resist is really great, and it's not at all my intention to say that this lack of interaction is a bad thing. In fact, it's likely that the opposite is true, that these would be worse experiences if they had more gameplay. Either way, the question is, should experiences like these be called games? Because when I think of the word game in the interactive medium, it typically means there is some kind of challenge involved. Maybe some kind of opponent, or at the very least a decision-making process that will significantly change how the game is played. Baseball, chess, solitaire, and Magic the Gathering, League of Legends, Dark Souls, and Hearthstone. I don't think anyone would argue that these are not games. Although some would like to argue whether or not these are sports, that's not what I'm really here to talk about. The point is that in all of these examples, there is a clear opponent, obstacle, or puzzle that is challenging the player, and finally that there are choices in how these get approached. Let's think about Dungeons & Dragons for a moment. D&D is a pretty easy example to drop into the game bucket, as it typically involves some kind of strategic thinking about how to reach your current objective. Whether it's sneaking into a bank, infiltrating a goblin camp, charming a king, or how your party is going to fight a mind flayer. In D&D, you have near infinite choices in how a session will play out, but your choices will give you varying levels of success, which is a big part of what creates the obstacle in D&D. There's a consequence to each action, and the result of them can differ wildly, and the sum of all your choices will most likely be the reason why you succeed or fail, unless you're exceedingly unlucky over and over again. But the point is that games have choices that impact the result as well as the how. Both of these I think are quite important, but the how you get there is probably the most important of all. For instance, the ultimate goal of Dark Souls is to defeat Gwyn, the Lord of Cinder, but you are given a huge set of choices in how this is approached, choosing a path to take, which weapon or accessory to equip, and how many times to fight Ornstein and Smough before giving up and farming souls before you try again. How each person experiences Dark Souls is going to be vastly different from one another based on those choices. But what if you took away all the combat elements from Dark Souls, as well as removing all the traps, damage, and whatever else? The Mossas just sit quietly within their chambers while the minions peacefully roam the lands. You can explore the world and see its different landscapes, creatures, and wonders, but nothing attacks you. There might still be a few levers hanging around so you can open up certain doors, but that would be about it. And instead of defeating Gwyn, he's just sitting near a bonfire waiting for your final decision on what to do with it. Again, the question is this still a game? I would argue that if there were a bunch of your clones running around the world, this is probably an experience close to what 1000 X Resist is. The how of your progression through the game is now far less varied, so it would be very close to how others see and experience it. We might go different directions or talk to different people before reaching our destination, but ultimately the how of getting through this experience will be almost indistinguishable. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that experiences without combat are not games. If you entirely removed the combat from D&D, you'd still have all the interactions with its world, people, the mysteries to solve, and wonders to uncover. The experiences would be more exploratory, but still leave plenty of room for decision-making that may or may not include dice rolling and other mechanics that significantly change how you reach your goal. And continuing deeper into this area gives us games like Disco Elysium, Return of Obra Dinn, Blueprints, and Outer Wilds, which again work a bit like the idea above and end up as these sort of exploratory puzzles or mysteries that often include some kind of role-playing element on top. Out of all of these games, Outer Wilds might be the one most on the edge of this idea of what is a game. It's an experience that is mostly an adventure about uncovering the secrets of this little solar system you reside in. There's definitely some challenge in controlling the ship, but also some puzzles to figure out and lots of information to piece together in order to figure out where to go. But what really sells the game part of Outer Wilds for me, more than anything else, is that there is no order to how you do this. The most amazing part of Outer Wilds is that just about everyone will choose a different direction to go, planet to explore first, and alien diaries to read, which means everyone who plays this game will have a fairly unique experience in how they played it and how they came to uncover the mysteries of the game. Continuing down this idea of removing things from games until they are no longer games, what if we take away those choices that you have in the matter of solving the mystery or puzzle in Outer Wilds? For example, what if the spaceship only had an autopilot and you had no choice of which planet to go to, where to land, and which path you took in order to find each new clue? Would this still be a game? Well, this finally brings us to the murky gray areas where we get experiences like What Remains of Edith Finch, Life is Strange, and of course 1000x Resist. Despite the extreme example of removing all choice from Outer Wilds, these experiences are not completely devoid of them, but they certainly have the least amount of them available by far, and are closest to being something like a book or a movie. But of course, with one big difference, you've still got a bit of control. That said, having a little control over something doesn't make it a game. It's certainly not a game when I walk over to my fridge, choose to open it, and reach in for a snack. Although I could make it into a game if I really wanted, I'd rather just have my soda without the hassle. But maybe the most important thing to notice here is that these are experiences that are played. Even in my own language, I'll say something like, I've recently played Disco Elysium, Outer Wilds, and 1000x Resist. So I think for many, because it's something you play, it's easy to think of something like 1000x Resist as a game. It's an interactive experience. Even if the interactions are low, it doesn't change how we verbalize or conceptualize it. You would probably never say something like, I've just read Disco Elysium, or The Stanley Parable, or even I just listened to 1000x Resist. You could easily say both of these things about a Dickens novel, but it just doesn't really apply to these experiences. You also wouldn't say you just watched What Remains of Edith Finch, even though most of what you will be doing will in fact be watching, reading, or listening. While it might seem really obvious, I think it's worth stating that we say play because fundamentally these are experiences that are interacted with and not watched or read. In fact, the interaction is so important to the thing being experienced that even if it is not the majority of how you spend your time experiencing the thing, it still takes priority. This brings us back to the drive within me that does not want to call things like 1000x Resist a game, even though we could probably just redefine game or give it a secondary definition to mean an interactive experience, but to me this feels messy and I'd rather just call it something else. But I do feel conflicted because even to me, calling 1000x Resist a game feels intuitive, yet at the same time another part of me revolts. It feels a bit too loaded with what I've already described what it means for something to be a game. Again, game means to me that there's meant to be some sort of challenge or obstacle involved that significantly changes the how of getting to a result. On the absolute cusp of this idea that's a good challenge to this definition is Journey. It's a short adventure through a desert with a few twists and secrets along the way. There are some actual obstacles throughout, but the largest one is playing with a randomly matched player. I think the interaction with this other player changes the how so much all on its own that it's enough to say Journey is a game. On the other hand, calling 1000x Resist a game just feels wrong. I think it's easy to understand that this kind of experience is almost completely removed from being something like Mario and Zelda, or even something a little more similar like Death Stranding or The Last of Us. Consciously, I don't feel like I can justify calling 1000x Resist a game. But calling it a walking simulator feels derogatory, and saying interactive visual novel, well, that definitely doesn't sit right. Terms like interactive visual novel or interactive adventure have been tossed around for experiences like these, but I hate this. Even just saying it aloud makes me feel gross. Especially any term including visual novel for this kind of experience. For me, it doesn't get the idea across properly or do the experience justice. They might as well have called it something like game movie or movie book. For me, the issue is mostly that novel is too closely associated with book, a thing that you read or listen to, not play. When I get to talking like this, part of me just wants to give in and say, none of it matters, isn't it just easier if we call it a game? But I can't. It's like calling a dictionary a novel. And in my mind, I can't justify that simply because they're both something you read. The important factor here is that they serve totally different purposes. In the same way, something like Mario and 1000x Resist serve totally different purposes. Although some might say their purpose is the same in that they are both meant to entertain, but I don't think that is quite right. You could say the same of a newspaper article and a novel. Entertainment is more so the potential result of these things rather than their intended purpose. For Mario, I would say its intention is to be a fun challenge that is either won or lost. The story of Mario is completely secondary and in the grand scheme of it is hardly important to the experience. Meanwhile, in 1000x Resist, anything you might consider a challenge or gameplay simply only exists to serve the narrative, because telling the story through an interactive means is the intention of 1000x Resist and not the gameplay. That said, the interaction is still really important. For instance, it might seem like we should be able to get a pretty similar experience of What Remains of Edith Finch whether we're watching or the one playing. But there is a big difference being in the driver's seat, moving the character around, spinning the knob of a music box, flipping through the pages of a book, opening a can of peaches, or simultaneously chopping salmon while going on an imaginary adventure. I don't think you can feel what the developer intended anywhere as strongly when you aren't the one in control. While this is an important distinction to make, I also don't think it's enough to make the experience a game. Again, when it comes to what is a game, the most important thing to me is whether or not this changes the how significantly. And here, being in control is just a different way to experience a pretty similar thing. Kind of like playing in a symphony on the stage versus listening from the crowd. The distinction in the how that I'm talking about is more like the difference between classical and jazz. In a lot of jazz, especially when playing with smaller groups, there's typically some sort of roadmap you get within the music being played. The chord progression, how many measures they'll last, and who's going to play when. But the rest of it is totally up to the group, and most importantly, what gets played along the way is totally up to the player in the moment. This is all to say Dark Souls is like jazz. Well, not really. The point is more so that games like jazz often follow some kind of predetermined roadmap, but still have significant changes in how you can go along it, while experiences like What Remains of Edith Finch and 1000 Exorcist are much more like classical music, where the roadmap and the how are much more set in stone with very little variance available. There might be slight differences in articulation, tempo, and dynamics from orchestra to orchestra, but it's only going to be changes that are noticeable to a pretty trained ear. Two different symphonies playing Brahms 4 is going to be mostly the same experience, but two different jazz combos playing Autumn Leaves will be almost completely different. In the same way, two different people playing 1000 Exorcist will be mostly the same experience, and two different people playing Dark Souls will be completely different. Now, I will say there is a very specific part of 1000 Exorcist that puts a small thorn in this idea, but it's at the very end and is only a small fraction of the experience. But also, it's maybe its most impactful moment because it finally has you make an actual decision with consequence. That said, I would say that this is more of a choose-your-own-adventure kind of fake-out leading to the bad ending if you choose wrongly. And in the end, the developers make it pretty clear what the good ending is. So, now for the hard part. I have no idea what in the world I should call this thing. I want to say something like ludonarrative. This makes the most sense to me, but I think a lot of people hate this word for some reason. Like, it's pretentious when someone says ludonarrative dissonance. But I think we need to rid ourselves of this prejudice, because for one, I personally find that ludonarrative dissonance is a real problem in games that gets too often overlooked. Probably either because it gets excused because it's a game, it's not that serious, or they're afraid of the internet bullies. Either way, I do think it's a good phrase and makes some sense here. It feels far enough removed from game and novel, but works rather well. Since ludo literally translates from Latin into I play, it would be I play the story or narrative. I guess narrative is a bit of a mouthful, so maybe we could just shorten it to something like ludative, ludonar, lunar, ludiv, or maybe just ludin or ludus. Oh hey, you should totally check out this ludin I recently played called 1000 Exorcist. It's about the world ending, clones, and generational trauma. You'd love it. I don't know, maybe it still needs some workshopping, but I don't think ludin is that bad. It's not too unnatural and feels somewhat nice to say. It's not as one-syllabic or catchy as game, but it doesn't associate with anything else in my mind. Except, I guess Ludin is some guy in a Banner Saga, and it's an item in League of Legends, maybe some people's surname, but whatever. Anyways, if you could all just start calling things like 1000 Exorcist a Ludin, that'd be great. Or if you could come up with a better name, please let me know. Either way, I'll probably still slip up and say game every now and then, it's just too ingrained within me. But maybe that's because I'm still missing something. It's not that unlikely that I haven't explored this idea enough to consider that maybe 1000 Exorcist is in fact a game. But what do you think? Is it a game or a ludin? Anyways, that's all I got for now, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Before any of you nerds bring up whether or not you read or play a choose-your-own-adventure book, I'd just like to say I would rather pretend they don't exist, and if you think they should exist,